I'm gonna rebuild this diorama using foam and 3D printed parts. And it's gonna be bigger and better than the original. Well, not bigger, it's gonna be the same size, but definitely better. I don't typically recreate dioramas, but this one is gonna be pretty easy because the dimensions are simple. So I got one of these project foam boards at Home Depot of XPS foam that's 24 inches by 24 inches, and this is 1 inch foam, which is exactly the dimensions of the base of this one. This is also a 20-inch high wall, so it's gonna be, again, 24-inch pieces, but they're gonna be 20 inches high. So I'll have 2 on the sides, 1 in the middle, just like you see here. I made this diorama over 3 years ago, and I want the new version to reflect all the improvements I've made over that time. I'm gonna take advantage of the fact that I have these walls as a template, and before I magnetize the base, I'm gonna mark out where the garage door and the front door are located so that I know that I can't put magnets in those areas, especially for the garage door, because the garage door is actually removable. So if I were to try to put magnets here, I would have a big problem. So all I'm going to do is take my X-Acto knife, make sure this is lined up, just put 2 little marks there, and then the same thing on the door frame. Just like that. Now that I know where those doors are going to be, I can actually magnetize the diorama, and I do that by using the first piece as a guide. I chose to place the magnets in the exact same spot as the original just to make things easier on myself. Once I knew where those needed to be, I took the opportunity to take my copper tubing and increase the indent of those places. All you need to do here is a simple twisting motion. And just like that, all of my magnet areas are mapped out. Now I just need to cut them out. I covered this in my magnetization video, but in case you haven't seen that, all I do here is take the magnet, outline where I want it to be, and then use my X-Acto knife to evenly cut a level line and then pop out the little circular piece of pink foam. Here they all are. And here's a shot of where they were. Next up, I use my low temperature hot glue gun to glue these magnets in place, and I'm very careful about the polarity of those magnets. For more on that, watch my magnetization video. If you've never done this before, it's really important to make sure that you use a glue gun that's on a low temperature setting. The high temperature setting will often melt the foam, which you absolutely do not want. You also want to make sure you put enough hot glue in each one of these holes to keep the magnets in place over time. Then I take the other magnets that are going to connect in the walls and I place them on top of the base magnets. I need to cut the height of the walls, which is going to be 20 inches tall, which I do with my Proxxon. So now this diorama is fully magnetized to mirror the layout of the original, and honestly this one's going to be much better off because I use higher quality magnets now than I used to when I made this diorama. So ultimately, this is going to be a sturdier, longer lasting piece. I don't always do things in the same order on every project, and this time for some reason I elected that I wanted to carve, texture, and paint the base before doing anything with the walls on the dio. For this process, I'm using an X-Acto knife, a T-square, and a bigger drywall T-square that actually spans the 2-foot area that I'm working on. It's really important to concentrate at this point. I don't want the X-Acto knife to slip and mess up my sidewalk separation areas, and I also use a very sharp knife to ensure that as well. Then I turn to my trusty ball of aluminum foil, which I almost always use to texture concrete surfaces. I'm not sure if you guys can notice this, but there's a little crack right here in the pink foam that I kind of want to accentuate because the client, Modern Toy Fair, really liked the crack work in the recent cracked concrete diorama tutorial that I did. For this kind of thing, I use a rock that I found in my backyard and I just press it into the foam and let the force of the pushing actually create some more natural looking cracks. So as you can see, I've been using my reference piece to develop my Modern Toy Fair piece. And something that's really important that I want to talk about here is how I am trying to improve upon the original. I'm not trying to do an exact replica. I want the piece to reflect the improvement I've had over the last 3 years. So I'm going to do that with a couple of different measures, and one of those is going to be the way that I treat the concrete. I'm going to use lightweight wall spackle to make the concrete floor look more realistic on the new version than it did on the old version. To do this, I take an old gift card and I take a little bit of the lightweight wall spackle on the gift card and I apply it to the piece, trying to apply it in thin layers. Doing this is really going to enhance the piece, and it's going to make my job a lot easier in trying to get believability from my paint job. And I do my best to get a pretty even distribution of this stuff on the dio. It doesn't have to be perfect, but this looks pretty good to me. Another thing that I do is I allow the wall spackle to get into the magnet crevices to help them be more stable overall. Something that I almost always do on commission builds is add in this little Vasco Toys 3D printed PLA plate to my dioramas, just so anyone that's looking at them is reminded that it was created by Vasco Toys. I almost always use Hot Wire Foam Factory Styro Goo to attach my PLA printed parts to my foam pieces. Okay, so now this is dry enough, the wall spackle is dry enough that I can actually paint this. But one other thing I just wanted to point out is the difference in how I'm going to paint this versus the original. This was base coated and then all dry brushed. And I think when you guys see how I do this differently, there's going to be a big difference. So I'm going to base coat this, then I'm going to do washes, then I might dry brush, and I might airbrush. When I was making this, I definitely wasn't doing a lot of washes, and I definitely had never even opened my airbrush yet. So we're going to go ahead and base coat this with a light gray, a granite gray by Apple Barrel. I try to apply a little bit to each concrete slab. From there, it's just a matter of getting a complete base coat that covers the entire piece with this acrylic paint. And now it's time to use a little dropper bottle to apply my black wash to this piece in a way that's going to make it look like realistic concrete. The key to this is to apply some of the black wash and then take a paper towel and just start blotting it all over the piece. This step is really going to bring out the texture that we established with the lightweight wall spackle earlier in the process. And just to be sure you get an opportunity, here's a comparison shot so you can see this versus the original. Now that I'm done with the base, it's time to start adding some detail to the wall, and that starts with the garage door. I used one of the raw prints. This is actually pretty much a failed print that I didn't end up using as the final piece to map out where the garage door needs to be on the piece based on the markings that I made early on in the video. Okay, so this isn't exactly the size I want it to be. It's actually an inch shorter than I want it to be, but that's okay. I can figure out how to account for that, which I did in Tinkercad, a free CAD program that I design all of my STL files in for 3D printing. I print the garage door using my Ender 3 Max, which is my largest printer, and I'm using Prusa slicer, setting my temperatures to 220 degrees Celsius, and then going ahead and slicing this up. This is going to take about 11 hours to print per side, so it is kind of a lengthy print, but I promise it's worth it. I also print these little window covers, which are much quicker to print, about 14 minutes for a 3-pack, and you need 6 of them total to do a double-sided door, so just about 30 minutes to get these done. I'm going to print this using my Ender 3 Max, which is my big printer, and I'm going to use Hatchbox PLA 1.75 and a PEI bed. Once my print comes off the printer, then I move on to sanding, and I start by using my Ryobi rotary tool, which is a pretty coarse head and helps me get some of the roughness off of this before I transition to my sandpaper, which I'm going to use several different grits to sand down to a smooth finish. And when I'm done, I use my shop vac to suck up all the excess dust from sanding. Off camera, I used a Rust-Oleum primer to paint this white before I started airbrushing this with a gray by Vallejo. I also airbrushed on some other colors, some mahogany brown, a little bit of black on top of this before gluing in the window frames that you see me applying here with some Hot Wire Foam Factory Styro Goo. At this point, I'm really just creating markings to make sure I know where everything goes, which is what I'm doing here for the windows using my X-Acto knife and my T-square. I do that same exact thing on the other two walls, the one with the garage, which I previously carved the garage area on, and the third wall. Here you can see all of the windows are outlined. None of them have actually been carved out yet, but I have an idea of where to cut. When I actually cut out the windows, I use a brand new box cutter and I make sure I do multiple passes to try and avoid fraying the foam, which is something that's very easy to do if you're using a dull knife or if you go too quickly. Then I'm able to use a sawing motion to actually cut the windows out as cleanly as possible. And I would caution you to take your time here. I always get really excited at different points in diorama making and I kind of want to rush through things, but it really doesn't pay off at all to do that, so just take your time and let the process happen. Next up, I do the same exact thing on my piece that's going to require the most cutting, which is the piece that includes that garage door I showed you earlier on. It's always a good idea to make sure that you shift the piece so that you can cut it as easily as possible. So for me with the sawing motion, that meant standing them up like this. Because I 3D printed the door and garage door, they're going to be incredibly precise in terms of the angles, and I want to be able to insert them reliably into the foam so that they fit almost in a friction fit. So I decided to use my Proxxon because there's no cleaner cut in foam than this kind of cutter. I did have to cut the top portion of the garage by hand though, because my Proxxon wouldn't reach in there cleanly, so I really tried to just focus on this and make sure that I had a straight up and down cut and went slowly through the entire portion of this. And then in a similar way to what I did with the magnetization, I used the 3D print of the double door to make an indent in the foam to show me where I'm going to need to cut this with the Proxxon. I want the door to feel as though it is inside the wall, not sitting on top of it, which is why I'm doing it this way. I absolutely love the Proxxon, but I do have a gripe with it. It doesn't have adjustable height on the cutting portion of the tool, which I think really limits it. But there's always a workaround, so what I decided to do is cut this piece in half and then cut it down in the indent spot that I made in the previous frame. With those pieces cut, I decided to do a dry run. I put these in first, both foam pieces. Then I take my two 3D printed parts of the door, which is the frame and then the door itself, just to make sure that this is lining up the way that I want it to. And for good measure, let's go ahead and pop these little 3D printed door handles on just for fun. I'm going to glue those foam components in here permanently, but before I do that, I want to take the opportunity to texture the corners of the edge of the doorway. And then once again, using my hot glue gun, I go ahead and glue in these piece by piece. I make sure I know which is supposed to be the top because I did hand cut the top portion of this, and which is supposed to be the bottom so it fits in there nice and snug as designed. I'm getting close to base coating this, but I realized that I overshot some of my cuts on the windows, and I don't want those to be visible on the final product, so I used the wall spackle to fill them in before base coating. When I originally painted the first diorama that we're recreating, I used Cafe au Lait by Anita's as the base color for the walls, but I am almost completely out of this and I definitely don't have enough to paint this diorama. So I'm gonna use a paint color sample that you would use. This is like house paint, Sherwin-Williams, that you would use on your house, like walls in your house. And I've had this for several years just sitting on the shelf. It's very close to that color, so I'm gonna use this instead. I started out base coating this just with a paintbrush the way I did on the base of the diorama, but I kind of realized that it was just gonna kind of take forever to paint this. I wanted to paint both sides of it, and I wanted to paint all three walls, so I decided to do something a little bit different. I've never done this myself before, but I've seen other diorama artists use a paint roller on this kind of diorama, and since I'm actually using paint that you would use on the walls of a house with a paint roller, I figured I'll give it a shot. I'm definitely glad I did this, especially on the second coat where I was really able to eliminate all the pink that was coming through from the background. But I will say I kind of wish that I had a smaller roller, because this one was a little bit unwieldy for me, as you can tell by it moving around all over the place as I paint this. But overall, it was definitely a time efficiency save for me, and I really couldn't argue with the results of how these looked base coated. It's time for me to dirty this up using a black wash. I chose to apply this with a foam brush and then blot it up with a paper towel. You'll notice that I'm doing this in sections, and that's because I wanted to make sure that I was doing this in manageable portions since this is such a big piece. I ended up doing this on all 3 of the walls, and I actually did multiple passes of the black wash over top because I like to do subtle layers to achieve the realism that I'm going for. And just in case you're wondering, my black wash for this project is simply black acrylic paint and water. Okay, I'm at the point in the build where I want to install the windows permanently into the diorama. So we're going to go ahead and do that. These vegetable chopping mats from Dollar Tree are what I use for my windows, and whenever I can, I stock up like crazy on these when I see them at the store because they're not always there. Luckily though, I've got plenty here to do this project. Really quick point on these Dollar Tree cutting mats. There is a textured side to these, and there's a smooth side to these. So I would say just pick if you want to glue the frames to the textured or the smooth side. I like to use the smooth side, so that's what I'm going to do. I line the 3D printed window up on the cutting mat and I mark it with a Sharpie. Then I grab my T-square and my X-Acto knife and I line it up against the edge of my cutting mat to make sure I'm getting an honest right angle cut. Using that process to pre-cut all of the window sheets. Before turning to my hot wire foam factory styro glue to spread the glue evenly as possible across the entire window frame using a scrap piece of foam. And then placing it with extra care so that I line it up perfectly. I don't want any of the cutting mat to stick out because that's going to affect the way that the window sits in the foam where we want the window inserted. And as you can see, we're looking pretty good with this first window. 1 down, 6 more to go. I like to do a dry fit of the windows before I permanently glue them in place. If I know that they're going to work as a friction fit, then I know that I have a better chance of having the glue really hold them over time. One of the reasons I didn't want to glue the windows in place is because I wanted to use my airbrush around all of the perimeter pieces of these walls, including the windows. I'm using a Vallejo mahogany brown to get an effect of dirt kind of coming up from the floor upwards on the wall pieces and around some of the areas that it would naturally accumulate, like around the garage door. Another thing I like to do when I can is to put the piece together and airbrush it as is. That way I get a nice cohesive look between the floor piece and the wall pieces. After the airbrushing and dry fitting the windows, here's how everything's looking. So far, so good. And before I do anything else, I am going to go ahead and glue all of the windows in place. Here's a look at the HVAC ductwork that I 3D modeled myself that we'll be using in this project. I modeled this little air duct and vent that is going to come down in this area right here. Ultimately, it's going to permanently be glued in here, but there are some things I need to do to fix this. There's a little bit of imperfections on this, so I'm going to sand this down as well. I don't have a ton to sand here, so I start out with sandpaper and then I move to my Ryobi rotary tool to get this edge perfect so that I can pop all the friction fit pieces together. I spray painted this off camera using a metallic Rust-Oleum paint, and this is a friction fit, so I made sure that I painted all sides of it, even though this is going to be glued together with hot wire foam factory styro glue, just because I wanted a complete paint job. Then I turned back to the hot wire foam factory styro glue to glue all these pieces together. So I have these little embellishment pieces that help sell the ductwork, and I'm gluing those on with a thin layer of this glue and then just carefully placing them an equal amount, just using the eye test, not doing any precise measurements here. I let that dry for a couple of hours, and then I broke out the airbrush to do a light coat of this Vallejo mahogany brown over top of some of the vented areas and other areas that I think dirt would accumulate. I also like to airbrush on some black from my metallic pieces, which you see me doing here to help up the realism. Now that I'm satisfied with the paint job, I'm going to go ahead and glue this down with Hot Wire Foam Factory Styro Goo, but I'm also going to guide this with a T-square. Once it dries, I take the opportunity to do some wash work underneath the vented area to add some dirt and grime that might have come through the exhaust. And I also apply a little bit under the windows. Now that that's done, I'm going to do the double doors using this spray paint. I didn't show it on camera, but I also sanded this down with several different types of sandpaper, and I primed it before painting. So if you guys have ever let a PLA print or plastic print dry outside, if it's in direct sunlight, it can warp like what you see here. So I'm going to try a solution to fix this using a heat gun, but if it doesn't work, I'm going to have to either reprint this or do something else. So let's see how it goes. This is something I really should have known better about because I live in South Carolina. It's the middle of summer. Normally though, the problem is that it was in direct sunlight. If it was in indirect sunlight, this probably wouldn't have been an issue. My thought process here was putting it down in the area I wanted it to melt to, while using the heat gun after having the glue would let it set in place, and then pushing it down with some foam scraps. Okay, so it did work, but I was not super careful and it melted the foam a little bit around the edge of this. But I actually think it kind of looks good in the setting of like a messed up, dirty old warehouse. And if anything, I could cover this up if the client wants me to. I did check with the client, Modern Toy Fair, and he actually liked this and thought it was an enhancement, so it was kind of a happy accident and all's well. So similar to what I did with the air duct, now I'm going to go ahead and use the airbrush to weather this up, first with the mahogany brown to darken this up around the door and the frames, paying specific attention to some of the edging and the door handles and things of that nature. Here's a better look at some of that detail work. I'm trying to dispense a little bit of paint at a time because I don't want to overdo it and have a big splotch on top of my door. I want it to look realistic, like this is an old warehouse door that's been used quite a bit. And then I did go back in there with the Vallejo black and also added some more dirt and grime and really enhanced the door handles on this step. There's still some edging work that I need to do for the warehouse, so I'm using my Proxxon to cut out some foam pieces for that. Just to give myself a rough idea of the trim work that I want to do right underneath the windows here, I went ahead and laid down the Proxxon cut beams that I'm going to use for this, and you can see that I still need to cut some of the excess here on each side. But I'm just trying to get an idea of where everything lines up. And another thing I'm going to have to do is cut these side pieces so that cut these so that this butts up directly against that on both sides. So I'm going to try to go ahead and get that done. So I was able to do what I was talking about. So now there's like a true corner, and this is just going to be up on the top here. I just have it on the bottom just to give me an idea. But I have a true corner on each side. Now I just have to trim down these edges, and then we're going to start texturing and painting those pieces before we glue them in place. And if you're familiar with the channel, you know that I'm using a ball of tinfoil to texture these pieces. It's probably also no surprise that I'm using Hot Wire Foam Factory Styro Goo to glue them. Or that I'm using acrylic paints by Anita's to paint this up with the base coat of gray. Here's how they look as they're drying before we glue them on. For this portion of the project, I really wanted to be careful to make sure that everything lined up, so I wanted to make sure I got a good tack on this glue, and that's why I always use my scrap piece to adhere that to the piece. And I had to take extra care here because I had two different pieces to line up. The trim work on the original diorama that I'm recreating didn't have as clean of trim work as I wanted it to. But I'm very happy to report that this one is nearly perfect. Really happy with the way that this all came out. Everything is lining up exactly the way that I want it. Off camera, I modeled a series of 3D printed parts that are going to be used, like these light fixture covers that I'm going to place over the door, the garage door light cover, which is the same thing but just a larger version that's going to go right over the garage and house those lights. and also some really cool utility box designs that are a first for this project. I sanded these down and primed them and was able to get what I think looks like a pretty good metallic finish for sort of metal utility boxes. This one is actually not painted yet. I'll get to that though. Quickly, I'll use this metallic silver to paint up the light fixtures. So the next thing that I'm going to do is prepare the diorama for wired lighting. So I have these mega LED lights from Evans Designs Lighting, and I also have some of these power packs that I'm going to hook up using some shrink tube and a little bit of heat. But the first thing that I have to do is puncture holes in the spots that I want the lights to come through in, and then we're going to install the fixtures. I'm using a handheld hot wire tool to puncture the holes in the walls. And then I just want to ensure that the lights are actually going to fit through, so I put them through all of the holes that I just punctured to test that out. Okay, so now I have the little LEDs put in here, and they're not glued in yet. I am going to apply some glue around where the hole is and stick these on with that glue. And then once all of the light fixtures are ready, I am going to place them like this, and you won't be able to see them. They're going to have a covering on the bottom like that, so that they'll kind of look really cool in place and they can distribute light downwards. Off camera, I used the same vegetable cutting mats that I used on the windows and pre-cut those to the different sizes of my light fixtures. Then I used some glue and applied it with a Q-tip to spread it evenly before gluing on those little vegetable mat pieces. Okay, so I've taken some twist ties, I've cut them into pieces, and I glued them over top of the wires just to make sure that the wire and the light itself doesn't move. So that's what this side looks like. And then let's test out how this light is going to be distributed on the front side of the diorama. So here's what it looks like with just the light without the fixture on it. I want to make sure that the fixture actually reflects the light down so it looks more realistic. So let's just see how that looks when we put that over top. To me, that looks great. I think that's going to be a very believable kind of effect with the light fixture shining down the light over top the door in all these different areas. Then it was time to glue. Used the same glue that I've been using this whole project, and I glued it over top of the door frame. And I really love this stuff. It does not take long to tack up, as you guys can see, and the lighting is looking awesome. And I'm personally really excited to see how the big light over the garage looks. I'm using the same exact process I just showed you with the glue and the Q-tip to get this in place. I decided to mount my power supplies with Velcro strips, which is very similar to what I did on my RPD station build. Watch that video for a full breakdown. Next up is the very important step of wiring the lighting. Before I actually do the wiring, I always test that the power supplies and the lights work, because if you do the whole process without doing that, you can be very frustrated if they don't end up working. But basically, you just match the colors together, tighten the wires around each other, and then place the heat shrink over top of them and melt it down using a heat source. I chose a lighter, but you could also use a heat gun or a hairdryer or anything like that. Here's how it looks with all of the wired lighting installed and functional. I'm so excited to see how Modern Toy Fair uses these in his ACBA setups. I also painted up the light fixtures so they would not look brand new. At this point, we're getting really close to the end of the build. I just need to install the 3D printed utility boxes that I designed. I'm going to be gluing these permanently in place. I have an idea of where I want them to be, so I start out with sort of my accessory pipe or my electric power pipe, and then I move on to the main utility box, which is this little dark gray one that I created. And then I decide to glue on the bigger box and a connector piece to kind of make it look like these two have a shared power source. My original plan was to put all of the utility boxes on the same wall, but I kind of rethought it and I wanted to have some over here by the garage door. So I have two identical boxes and then two identical little power strips that are meant to look like they're connecting the power supply of the boxes. I think doing it this way makes it more visually interesting. And it looks like Spider-Man and Captain America agree. But seriously, I wanted to get some Legends in here so you could see how these size up height-wise from Marvel Legends. So personally, I think these beams look a little bit too clean right now because I haven't done any washes or anything on them. So we're going to go ahead and use the Vallejo paint that we did some airbrushing with, and we're going to do some watered down washes of those. Whenever I do washes, I do them in a really watered down way so that I can apply subtle layers of my washes over time, just to make sure that I don't mess things up when I'm trying to apply it. I don't want it to appear too heavy-handed, so that's kind of my approach with washes. The absolute last thing that I do is dry brush the fixtures, and I think this is fitting because the first piece was completely dry brushed, and this one, showing my improvement, shows that I don't rely as heavily on that skill 3 years later. Alright, so here's the final version of the new diorama versus the final version of the old diorama, and I hope that you guys think that this one is much improved after seeing the entire process. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope that you will subscribe to the channel after watching this whole series. Thank you so much. I will see you in the next episode.
Vasco Toys. Action figure dioramas and props.